It meant that a certain generation, or a couple of generations, had had a political exposure that was truly unprecedented in recent American history. Not only the freedom riders who went down, but practically every campus in the country was affected by it, and not only because various faculty and students went to Alabama and elsewhere, but because it became a standard topic of conversation to learn how the movement was doing, what kind of obstacles were being met, and what we could do. And there were marches and marches and marches, so that it was a political experience that was, I think, as I've said, unprecedented in terms of its intensity and in terms of the huge number of citizens being involved of a younger age.
And yet, when we look back at the 1930s, what I think marked the so-called New Left was that it was not coupled with labor.
No, it wasn't. No, it wasn't. The 30s were kind of a peculiar thing. I mean, it shouldn't be simply dismissed, because it did have lasting influence, because it showed, to some degree at least, that it was possible to get a progressive administration, that Roosevelt, whatever his failings and shortcomings, had shown that with sufficient popular support, you could manage to make some kind of dent in the kind of political privileges that existed in the country, and help to benefit the economic plight of most people. And he did make serious attempts. It of course ran into all kinds of problems, but that's the nature of politics. But I don't think it can be underestimated the extent to which the New Deal influence spread throughout the society. I think it had an extraordinary effect, long-run effect, in terms of igniting ideas about popular participation and its possibilities.
And yet it was really a response to the breakdown of capitalism.
It certainly was. I mean, it had its limitations, but I think there's a very real question about how far the country was prepared to go at that time. It's important to remember that the early 30s, meaning by that from 1932, say, on, was not only a period of New Deal ferment, it was also a period of reactionary ferment, and that one mustn't forget such things as the Liberty League, and also, and above all, Father Coughlin, who was an extraordinary figure, someone who began as a defender of the New Deal and ended up as a bitter anti-Semite, and had to be disowned, or at least throttled, by his own church. It had become so extreme. But there were a lot of things percolating in those years, and on both sides, because I've said the New Deal and the liberal resurgence also in effect caused caused a reaction that I think led to a kind of permanent, I want to say, permanent conservative realization that it had to develop a kind of standing set of its own institutions and foundations and fundraising activities all the year round, not just to wait for elections, but to become a kind of permanent force, a conscious conservative force in American politics from the ground up.
You talk in, I think it's in Politics and Vision, about how fascism arose out of Weimar, which was essentially a weak democracy, and yet you argue inverted totalitarianism, certainly a species of totalitarianism, can often be the product of a strong democracy.
It can, in the sense that that strong democracy can do what its name implies. In the pursuit of popular ends, it develops inevitably powerful institutions to promote those ends. And very often they lend themselves to being taken over and utilized. For example, that popular means of communication and news information and so on can become, very easily propaganda means for corporate capitalism, which understands that if you gain control of newspapers, radio, television, that you're in a position to really shape the political atmosphere. That becomes a problem in terms of finding people willing to take a certain risk with the understanding that while they're taking a risk, it won't be so fatal to their life chances. But I'm afraid it is now.
Right.
And it doesn't bode well, because it seems to me in a left-handed sort of way it encourages the kind of professionalization of politics that results in the kind of political parties and political system that we've been warned about from the year one.
And a political passivity,
Yeah.
which you say, you talk about classical totalitarian regimes mobilize the masses, whereas in inverted totalitarianism, the goal is to render the masses politically passive. And you use Hobbes to describe that. Could you speak a little bit about that?
Well, Hobbes is interesting because he writes in the so-called social contract tradition, and that had been a tradition which grew up in the late 16th and 17th century. The social contract position had furthered the notion that a political society and its governance should be the result of an agreement by the people as to what sort of government they wanted and what sort of role they wanted to play for themselves in such a government.
And that fostering of political passivity, you said or have said in your work, is caused by what you were speaking about earlier, the economic insecurity, the precariousness of the position, which I think you go back to Hobbes as citing as one of the kind of fundamental controlling elements to shut down any real political activity.
I think, yes, I believe that very strongly. I think if you go back way to the Athenian democracy, one of the things you notice about it is that it paid citizens to participate. In other words, they would be relieved from a certain amount of economic insecurity in order to engage actively in politics. Well, when we get to our times and modern times, that kind of guarantee doesn't exist in any form whatsoever. We barely can manage to have an election day that isn't where we suspend work and other obligations to give citizens an opportunity to vote. They have to cram a vote into a busy, normal day. So that the relationship between economic structures and institutions and political institutions of democracy are just really in tension now, in which the requirements of the one are being undercut by the operations of the other.
Automatic voting registration, I'd be all for that. We should make it as easy to vote as possible. Our turnout rates are quite low in the scheme of things internationally. And you're right that part of that is deliberate. Part of that is that people just want to make it a little bit harder for certain types of people to vote, which means, in my opinion, then that they must know that something is going on. Like, if you're practicing democracy effectively, you should not fear the voters.
Yeah, so then what about an incentive solution here? So imagine the federal government said, we send money to every state, but we'll discount it by the proportion of people who don't vote. So or who aren't registered to vote. So if only 80% of the eligible voters were registered to vote in your state, we'll cut the amount we're going to give your state by 20% or take 20% off.
Yeah, I love incentives. It's like a race to the top for registering voters. I love putting resources to work in that way. Our political system at this point has been captured by huge corporate interests and moneyed interests. So the way you counteract that is you give every citizen 100 democracy dollars that can only be donated to a political campaign. And that would wash out the corporate money because $100 times even a minority of citizens is a much higher sum than all of the money that's being spent on lobbyists and the rest of it. So that one move ends up recapturing democracy and making it so that if someone like me appeals to 10,000 people, I get $1 million. Whereas right now, I have to appeal to 10,000 people and then go get the $1 million from some rich people. That's the real process. So if you can actually unify the money and the people, then you can fix democracy.
You talked about doing your taxes kind of like gaming.
Yeah. So when you think about, running the government like a business is nonsense. They're two very different things. Mm-hmm. But one thing that the government can learn from business is that businesses don't treat their customers like crap. And our government treats us like crap come tax day. We're giving the government hundreds of billions of dollars. And do we ever get any kind of celebration of that fact? I mean, if we were customers, people would be like, oh my gosh, you gave us hundreds of billions of dollars. So I would make tax day into a national holiday. I would call it revenue day. I would have it so that AI tries to pre-fill out your taxes for you. So if you have very simple taxes that are based upon the same info, it just gets spit out for you. And then you'd get a video showing where your money's going, government employees thanking you. And then you can choose where to send the last 1% of your money, being like, you know what, I really want to fund these programs. And then there'd be someone from that program being like, well, thank you for choosing this program. Then you'd get Oprah and Tom Hanks and The Rock in on this video. And then we'd actually not mind Revenue Day because we'd be like, oh, and then I'd invite families from every state to the White House and celebrate our society.
That's real,
Instead of treating tax day like this thankless chore that we all dread. We're like, oh, it's like,
I don't owe you nothing, America. Tell me thank you.